So the private benefit rule stems from the basic requirement that 501c3 organizations be operated exclusively for charitable, educational, religious, scientific, or other proper 501c3 purposes. The concept here is that a 501c3 organization, in order to have that status, needs to benefit the general public in some way, rather than the interests of, a small group of persons or private business entities or something like that. Now, before I get into the specifics of the private benefit rule, because it's tricky to apply and a little trickier than it may seem, the difference that you asked with the private inurement, excess benefit transaction, and those kind of rules is that the private benefit rule is much more broad in a way. So those classic conflict of interest rules are focused on the people who run the organization. So if you're in a position of controlling, running a nonprofit 501c3 organization, the rules are set up to prevent you and your family members and related businesses from profiting off of that control. And that's what you see in a standard conflict of interest policy, making sure that any dealings between board members, high-level management, family members, et cetera, are always on fair market terms at the most or more generous to the organization, having a process to review by people who don't have that financial interest. And that's the point of the inurement and excess benefit transaction rules. The private benefit rule, in contrast, applies not just to what we call those insiders or disqualified persons. You've got to be thinking about all individuals, businesses, non-charitable entities that have some dealings with the organization or are benefiting from the organization's programs. So that's, in essence, the idea here. The private benefit rule, as I said, is much broader, and it's also kind of more abstract and conceptual. The conflict of interest rules, they can get complicated, but they're fairly mechanical and easy enough to apply in practice. But the private benefit rule, it's kind of just inherent in the notion of what charity is, that there's a benefit to the public in helping people who need the help, filling a gap in society that's not being filled by the private sector. And it's something that we don't always articulate and sometimes take for granted because of that. The specifics of how the private benefit rule is applied come from Treasury regulations and IRS guidance. So this IRS guidance basically says that the assets and activities of a 501c3 organization cannot be used to benefit the interests of private persons, except to the extent this benefit is incidental to the organization's proper 501c3 purposes. And by incidental, there are two components to this. There's a quantitative component, in other words, the amount of benefit has to be incidental, and there's a qualitative component, which means just the character and the type of the benefit. So quantitatively incidental means insubstantial compared to the benefit conferred on the general public by the activity. So there's a relationship there. We need to look at how much private persons are benefiting and compare that to the benefit that the public as a whole gets, and look at the relationship between the two. In terms of qualitatively incidental, this means that it's inherent in the activity that confers the public benefit. So in other words, if you're going to do this activity that has a benefit to the public and is proper within 501c3 purposes, there is just no way to do it without benefiting some private individuals in the process. So if it's quantitatively and qualitatively incidental, then we don't worry about the private benefit. If not, then it's potentially a problem. So Mike, is this making sense so far?
Yeah, I think it's starting to order things. And maybe just from a general perspective, I always think of the private benefit rule as sitting over top of the other rules, even though they're not designed that way, because I think the other rules are sort of subcomponents one way or another of the private benefit rule. And I use that when I'm talking to like board members and staff for the outward perception.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think of it. And it kind of makes sense to me because the private benefit rule is like core to having a set of programs that are consistent with being a 501c3. And when I'm working with somebody, Mike, and when we work together, somebody's starting a new 501c3 organization that they want to apply and get that status, the first thing we're talking about is, well, what are you going to do? And we're talking about their programs, and will these programs even qualify? And the private benefit rule is a really big part of that. It's sometimes the main part of the discussion. So step one of an organization is having programs that qualify, and that's really fundamental. And then everything else that flows down from that, what is the role of the board members and the officers and the high-level staff, and are they benefiting as well? That goes to your conflict of interest policy, and it's more mechanical. But I think you're right. The private benefit rule sits above them in a way, because without
exactly
501c3 proper purposes and programs, there's not really anything to talk about beyond that.
Yeah, even in inurement rules and such. But so let's to make this maybe even a little more clear. Could you go over some illustrative examples how it applies to common programs and activities?
Oh, sure. Well, I will start with kind of the classic examples that are in the IRS guidance. The main one that is always cited is IRS Revenue Ruling 70-186, and we talk about this in the article. But very simple concept. There was a public lake. People in the community could use it as a recreational area, and there was an organization formed to clean up and enhance that public lake. Now, the benefit to the public there is obvious, since it was a place of recreation for the community, but there were homeowners around the lake who would also benefit from that. Their home values might go up. They get a better lake to live near. So this is in the year is 1970, as you could tell from the title of the revenue ruling. This is an early example of the IRS grappling with this and how to balance the two. And the IRS held that that was okay in that instance. The benefit to the public was the main thing driving it, and that was clear and obvious. And you couldn't really enhance the lake itself without benefiting the people who happened to live there. And in this example, the IRS felt that that was sufficiently incidental. So big, clear benefit to the public, some tangential benefit to the homeowners, but really incidental in pursuing that purpose. Now contrast this with another revenue ruling, IRS Revenue Ruling 75-286. Similar, but with a very different outcome. This one involved a membership organization that was formed to preserve and beautify a single city block on which the members of the organization owned property. And in this one, the IRS concluded that this was impermissible private benefit, because the benefit to the public here was just too narrow. One little city block, and with nothing more than that, that was not enough, because the benefit to the people who own the property too direct, not enough public benefit to offset that. So really, it does a good job, these two examples, of illustrating how the private benefit rule is really a matter of amount and proportion of public benefit to private benefit, and that's a really big part of it. Now, there's other examples that are probably more relevant. I'll go through some of these, and a lot of them have their own special rules that have been built on top of the private benefit rule, but the private benefit rule is really driving the analysis. So first one I'll mention, Mike, is assistance and aid programs. If you think about it, this raises an interesting private benefit question, because you're giving resources and assistance to people who need it, and that is by definition helping them individually. But what the IRS says here is that as long as you are serving at what's called a charitable class, basically people who are struggling and need the assistance, then that's okay. It's a proper 501c3 purpose, and that the fact that these individuals benefit, that is just incidental, because you can't help a charitable class without helping people individually. Another one I'll mention, scholarships. That, again, you're providing aid and assistance to certain people, in this case to further their education. And there are special rules about this, but if you do it right, And as long as it's targeted at helping people attain education, then the private benefit to those people individually is considered incidental, because the main thing is that you're furthering educational purposes. But you've got to meet some requirements. The eligibility needs to be wide enough to confer a public benefit, needs to be tied to certain educational aims. There needs to be non-discriminatory criteria in selecting the recipients. Got to be careful of board members and their families being eligible. But as long as you comply with that, you're going to be okay.
Yeah, Ben, I think instead of giving other examples, because we could go on examples, I think the question I always try to put, especially in front of people who aren't like, at the board level, lower level staff that are not relying on certain individuals like us to get down into the details, is answer one question on the front end, or more, always make sure this question is answered in the positive. Is the primary purpose of the program related to the mission and the organization and who they're trying to benefit, and not an individual?
Right.
And this goes to your one where you talk about, an individual family will get assistance, but it's helping out a class of people. The primary purpose is to help out a class of need, or a defined class of people. So I think, with this, you always have to be able to answer that first question, yes, and then you start to go down. I don't know if that helps or not.
Right. It's important to be wary of where private benefit may be lurking, and to really be attuned to that, and to not lose sight of, is this program helping somebody individually? Go through the thought process. Well, what is the public benefit that is being pursued by this project? Is the private benefit incidental? You've got to think it through and be aware of where there may be private benefit. But in terms of problem solving and brainstorming, what I do a lot and spend a lot of time with clients on is thinking of ways to enhance the public benefit part of it. Because like I said, a lot of it comes down to proportion. And if it looks kind of out of balance, like you said before, Mike, if the public benefit is not super clear and really overriding everything, you're going to be in a position to have more trouble. So if there are ways to enhance and add more public benefit, that can put your organization in a position of offsetting some private benefit that may be a concern otherwise, but if you offset it with enough public benefit, may be less of a concern.